Please join me in welcoming Bob Poznanovich.
Good morning, everybody. I get the pleasure of having to follow Jody. Let me thank everybody, including the Alliance, for having kind of the courage to even have this discussion today. Obviously, I think this is an important topic, and over the years, when my colleague Joe Sicinas and I are here with somebody in the room, used to do these events, it would be really hard to get people to show up to talk about addiction. So I appreciate all of you showing up as well and giving us, those of us who are passionate about this, the opportunity to share some of our experience and hope for this. People ask me if I ever get nervous speaking in public. In fact, here and I were talking about that, and I said, there's nothing I enjoy more than a podium, an audience, and my own voice. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to hear my own voice and to speak again about something I got passionate about. In general, what I'm going to talk about today is who's affected by addiction, how we get affected and addicted, and what that looks like. I'm going to talk about the cost of addiction. I'm going to talk a little bit differently about what you could do about addiction, since there's some really good information in your kits, and Jody talked about it in detail. I'm going to take a little bit different spin than I had planned on it, but I think you might find that helpful. And I do want to talk about the value of treatment in a lot of different ways. And I want to start where Jody kind of left off when she talked about her daughter saying, this doesn't look like an addict. I'd like you to pause for a second and think about when we mention drug addict or alcoholic, who do you think of? Is it the person living under the bridge? Or the homeless person? Is it the overindulged, enmeshed, protected celebrities? Or is it these people? Your coworkers, the operators of heavy equipment, the people in charge of QA at your factories, your doctor, your pilot, or God forbid, the person who we trust driving our kids to school every day, the school bus drivers. Or even worse, did you think about these people? Your family, your children, or their children. The reality is addiction affects everybody, regardless of your education, of your profession, of your wealth or power, your geographic location, race or religion, and even if you're in a blue or a red state. Addiction doesn't discriminate, and the size of the problem is huge, and we've been dealing with it for a long time. That's a picture from the 1920s when addiction and opiates really started. I mean, we were putting cocaine in bottles of Coca-Cola back in those days, and that's when morphine was given out for just normal pain control by physicians, going back to the 1920s. And not only does it affect 22 million workers, I think it's people throughout the country, I think it's really important to recognize that almost 70% of those are employed. So statistically speaking, the least likely person to be addicted to drugs or alcohol is that person living under the bridge. It's most likely to be the person that works next to you. And if it's not that person, it could be that person's family. It's pretty much impossible today, and I've been doing this for a lot of times, for a long time, not to meet somebody who somehow hasn't been affected by addiction in their home, in their family, in their home or in their family. If you do the math on how many people in a family, how many people are addicted, it's pretty hard to find that 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 of us has something going on somewhere. So the size of the problem is huge, and it's been around for a long time. And I know this is about opioids, but I want to talk, as Jody did too, about all drugs. So I don't know why, and I was talking to Cheryl about this, opiates got so much attention. But I'm thankful that it did, because it got us all here. And I'm not sure if it's opiates has gotten so much attention because of the fast death, but addiction has been killing us for a long time, but maybe slower. And one of the biggest killers of that is alcohol. At the Hazeldon Betty Ford Foundation, we treat hundreds and hundreds of people a day. Alcohol is still king. Half of all the people we treat are alcoholics. And if I'll go back to you as the cocaine addict area, and I'll say this gentleman next to you was a heroin addict, and I was a cocaine addict, and we all went to the emergency room at the same time. Who do you think the nurse is going to run to first? The alcoholic, the drug addict that's on cocaine, or the heroin addict? Who's nursing going to look at first? Any guesses? The alcoholic. The biggest chance of dying from quitting using is from alcohol. The person who just drinks red wine, through the detox process could die. Now, you might want to die if you're detoxing from heroin and cocaine, but you're not gonna. So we minimize, I think, alcohol, and I know there's data on Wisconsin's usage is some of the highest alcohol usage in the country. I'm working with we have 2 hospital systems in Eau Claire who said that corridor is one of the highest alcohol usages in the country. So I agree with Jody that it's not just about opiates. It's about alcohol and other drugs and benzodiazepine and stimulants. But however we got here because of the opiate epidemic, I welcome the opportunity to raise all ships and have all conversations. I will share some data on opiates, and I'll share some things that we're doing differently in treatment for opiates, but the reality is how we get addicted and how we treat it and the consequences of it don't differ. It's the speed of which we potentially die or kill others that might. So speaking about opiates, this is some data that I've got from an insurance company I thought was really interesting that shows some of the rise in costs at the payer level for opiates. You can see some of the data up there. The claims increased pretty significantly in just a short 3-year period, and that 67% of all of the opiate cases or substance use cases were opiates, and the cost of treating opiates went up. Now, my perspective on why 67% of the substance use cases are opiates is that it's harder to hide the opiate use in the workplace, and it's harder to control and it's faster to an addiction. So I think that's why you're seeing the raise, and I don't think it implies that 67% of the people struggling from an addiction are opiate addicts. I think it's those that are accessing treatment services or that are submitting claims. And I'm going to talk about claim data later on because I think it's really some interesting data and some research that we've done on that problem. And Jody talked about some of these data points with regards to opiates, but most of it starts as you've been hearing over the years. When we talk about the opiate addiction, it really just starts with the prescription opiate abuse. And about a third of the people who take opiates abuse them, and abuse them can mean just not using them as directed. I call it opiate. I have a phrase that kind of says it's that simple dyslexia of addiction. Instead of taking 1 pill every 4 hours, I take 4 pills every 1 hour. It's a simple math equation, but the reality is it adds to a big problem. And you could see from the progression of the disease, where it goes, and that a high percentage of people who use opiates abuse them, a high percentage of people that abuse them become addicted, and a high percentage of those who are addicted move to heroin because it's easier, cheaper, and actually better for you on your system for long-term use than some of the pain pills. And it works really well until it stops working. Jody mentioned this, and I want to talk about something I think is really important in stigma and how we recognize addiction as a chronic illness. For many years, even the Hazeldon Foundation, who has been doing this for 70 years, viewed addiction initially as an acute illness, in that you would come to treatment, you'd spend 28 days with us, and we would send you home. But our research showed over time that addiction is very much a chronic illness. That is just like other chronic illnesses, that there is no cure. However, there is a path to wellness, and that requires treatment and ongoing behavioral changes to support that change. And over time, we've changed the model from a very intensive clinical care to a process that moves people from clinical care to self-care, and I'll be talking about that. But what happens to somebody during this addiction process is that we like what drugs do to our minds. And it's the changes in that brain chemistry that start to change the addiction. We use drugs because drugs make us feel better. And it was about what we call the dopamines. It's that chemical in our brain that helps us feel better. It's about excitement, and it's about comfort, and it's about feelings of happiness that's produced naturally in our brain. But once we start taking drugs, our brain's ability to produce the dopamines naturally start to fade. And we get more dependent on that drug to produce those for us. And then with drug usage, the more drugs we take, the less drugs work. So we've got to take more drugs. And then often, it's that drug may not work, so we'll have to take other drugs or change the ways that we take that drug. And as we do that, that brain chemistry further changes. And if you could look at the brain before usage and during usage, you can see that the frontal lobe has changed. And that's the part of the brain that controls rational thought and behavior. I talk about the stages of alcoholism, not as a clinician or a doctor would, but in simple terms that maybe you could understand or appreciate. Stage 1 is this part about control. So this might be the social drinking part. And this is the part where you've got control over when you start drinking and when you stop drinking. And this could be after hours, a couple people from work are getting together, and we're going to go to the bar. And you could say on that day, I'll go, and I'll have a drink. And you might go and have a drink and go home. The next time they might invite you to the bar, and you would say, I'm not interested. That's control of when you start using and control of when you stop using. I think that's that social user perspective, where there really isn't consequences, you're in control. The second stage, however, is when you're starting to lose control because of the changes in the brain chemistry, that you are starting to lose control over when you could say yes to starting to use, and you might start losing control over when you stop using. So for example, I might say, today I don't want to drink, I'm not going to the bar. I've got control over when I stop. But when I go to the bar, that one drink turns into 2, turns into 3. Before long, I don't have control over when I stop. That's that binging that will happen. And the more that happens, the more the brain chemistry changes. There are some deterioration of your internal value system that starts to change. Families that I've worked with always would say, there was a point in time that my son is no longer the son I knew, or my husband isn't the guy I married. And that's when these changes are taking place. I talk about it like a committee meeting going on inside your head. When you're a young kid and you're not using drugs or alcohol, it's one person and one vote. And when today was a day to play baseball, I played baseball. But as I use more and more drugs over time, people start showing up at this committee meeting in my mind that are addicted. And over time, I start to lose more votes. So today I had the ability to win a vote on the committee that says I'm not going to go to the bar and drink with people. Tomorrow I decide that I'm going to go drink with them, but the committee takes over and says we're not going to stop drinking. And what this becomes is a battle for control. And this is where you'll see the anger sometimes build up. And the next step that we fall into when we start that chasing is the loss of all control. When I've reached this chronic stage, I no longer have control over when I start using or when I stop using. Now, it takes about 20 years on average to get to that stage for alcoholism. It takes about 7 years for cocaine. and it takes less than a year for methamphetamine and opiates. So the type of drug, the way you use it, and the frequency of it impacts these stages. And when you reach that final stage of loss of control, then you start to do really dumb and risky things. I don't know how many people have seen this picture over the years. So mathematically, this is interesting because there's 12 people there. And if you look at one of the 12, sorry, my red circle is off, it's on the wrong guy. But look at the 12th guy. I never noticed this picture for all those years I've seen this picture until somebody else pointed this out to me. The third guy has a bottle on that beam. Now, so 1 in 12 or 8% are addicted to alcohol. But think about workplace risk, danger to him, the people working on him, the people under him. Like I said, we've been chasing this problem for a long time, and we've been making a lot of bad decisions. You know, God forbid those decisions affect us when we're in safety-sensitive positions, like this lady here, who a few years ago was arrested outside of Chicago for driving a school bus impaired 3 times the legal limit for alcohol. And she had just finished dropping off her run, which had 50 kids in it. And the other startling part about this is everybody knew about it at work. There's a lot of suspicion, but nobody knew what to do about it, and nobody said anything. You know, fortunately, this didn't end up in tragedy, but you've heard of stories where it does. You know, I can't think of a greater risk than trusting those who are supposed to protect us from those bad decisions. This is a picture of a Fortune 200 executive's house who was in a place in Chicago called Astor Street, which is on the Gold Coast, before he started using. This is a picture of that same house during his usage. This gentleman was a tweaker, and when he was high, he would take things apart. And he also became, we talk about insanity, and psychosis. Somewhat crazy, you can see it, I think that's vomit. There was a belief that the person had bugs crawling on him, so he put all of his furniture and clothes in the shower and would spend hours and days picking at his face because of bugs. And that's some of the scars you see in the mirror. This person was in charge of, again, a Fortune 200 company, in charge of hundreds of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. That's my house. And that's my story. So I will share a little bit of information on this because I think it's important to see a face on addiction. My name is Bob, and I'm an alcoholic and an addict. Never in my wildest dreams did I ever expect to be in an audience like this talking about that. I think it's important to know my story, too, because it talks about the susceptibility of all of us to this. I grew up from immigrant parents who moved here from Serbia to work in the steel mills of Chicago. And I was born and raised on the southeast side of Chicago, which is a tough neighborhood that a lot of families immigrated to work in the steel mills. And I was taught the important lessons of working hard, making a career, and doing something about myself, doing something with my life. My neighborhood was tough, and there was a lot of drugs around growing up. I remember as a young kid in the alley, I used to watch guys shoot heroin. Many friends in grammar school sniffed glue back in the day. And then it progressed in the 60s to acid, other drugs, including heroin. And many times it ended up in the death of my young friends. Jackie, Louie, Stevie, Joey, and Gordon were all buddies of mine who died from heroin overdoses before we were done with our sophomore year in high school. Drugs were a big part of my life as I grew up, but not for me. I was afraid of drugs. I saw what drugs were doing to my friends and their families and our communities. And despite all the social pressures that you get, I had the courage to say no. I never wanted to be a drug addict. I never wanted to be an alcoholic. I never wanted to end up or settle like those other guys did. So I got lucky and went to college and became very successful very fast. By the time I was 30, actually when I was 29 years old, I became the vice president for Zenith, for some of you who might be old enough to remember who Zenith was. We were the largest manufacturer of computers in the world. I mean, we were one of the largest manufacturers of computers in the world, and we're the largest manufacturer of TV for many years. We're a $2 billion company, $1 billion, which came from computers, which not a lot of people know. I was in charge of product development and business development for Zenith. Many of the ways that we use computers today, many of the innovations that were done with computers were done by me and my team, working directly with Paul Allen, Bill Gates, and competing with Steve Jobs directly. I couldn't believe where I was. I grew up in the south side of Chicago. I ended up in the boardrooms of America's business, dealing with the greatest brains in the world, affecting change. I had the world in my hand. I was making more money than I ever thought was possible. My neighborhood was proud, my family was proud, and I was proud of myself. But then I forgot all those lessons I learned growing up on the south side of Chicago, and that's what bad things happen to people that use drugs. Mind you, I didn't take drugs, or I didn't even drink. But one day I showed up at a party. And for those of you who might know Chicago, the Water Tower place, maybe in the 70s or 80s, whatever it was, was one of the first Chicago multi-million-dollar condos, and Oprah lived there. I don't think it was before Oprah, but that was a big place to go. And I was invited to a party at the Water Tower place. I mean, right around those neighborhoods, but never thought I'd be in those neighborhoods. And it was a bank president's house. And he literally came out with a tray of cocaine on a platter, probably silver. I'll say it's silver, sounds good. And I looked around the room and people started doing lines. There was a current NBA basketball player there. There was bank presidents. There was a newscaster from the local ABC affiliate. When I looked at these people, I was like, these aren't the guys in the room. These aren't the guys I used to run away from in the alley. These are the guys I want to be. If it was okay for them, it was okay for me. So I started using cocaine too. I know the science will tell me that I wasn't addicted immediately, but I'm not sure of that. I love the effect. It maximized my strength, minimized my weaknesses. I think it also played into my grandiosity, because cocaine was called the new champagne then by Time magazine, on the cover of the Time magazine, right? Remember that article? And I thought, that was it. I made it. I'm downtown. I got a big job. I'm invited to these big parties, and I have enough money to use cocaine. For a long time, I was able to manage my drug use, just like I talk about those stages, by saying no. No, thank you, not tonight. Or I'll stop when the sun rises, or just do a couple of lines, or I'll do it every other weekend. I put a lot of rules in place. And then what happens when you can't manage the rules you set? You change the rules. So you just accommodate yourself. So instead of using cocaine every other Saturday night, it was every Saturday night, and then Friday nights, and then Thursday nights and the Friday morning. And then I no longer stopped when the sun rose. I just closed the curtains and kept going, into Sunday and Sunday night. And I often laugh when I mention this to drug addicts. They'll get it. When I would say those birds, those damn birds. It would just, what would be so beautiful hearing the sound of a bird in the morning was just horrible for a drug addict knowing that you lost another night, another day. I couldn't believe how early birds would start singing in Chicago in the morning, but it was, for me, it was a really kind of a good indicator of sick and healthy. It was when birds became sick, and the sound of that to today makes me get healthy. And as my disease progressed, financially, I was using maybe $50 a weekend or every other weekend habit. And slowly, it started to develop to a $200 a day habit. But I was still managing it somehow. By that, I mean I was going to work. I was showing up. But I was getting addicted and I denied it and I was trying desperately to control it and I was losing. And it was starting to affect every part of my life. Work was no longer important to me, but I liked the power, the money, the status, and the prestige. So I showed up. But I stopped working towards my business career, my business connections, and I started focusing on drugs and my drug connections. Drugs was absolutely becoming my higher power. I just didn't know it or realize it at the time. And as time went on, my drug usage had gone from $50 a day to $200 a day to at the end I was using $1,000 a day to support my drug habit, and any drug. I talk mostly about cocaine, but I even drank. At the end, I never even liked alcohol. But I used that to manage off the effect of alcohol. And every part of my life was for shit. And every part of my value system was destroyed, as were most of my business and social relationships. I had lost, by the time my disease had gotten to the end, about $500,000 in cash, which was pretty devastating to a family. I think we had 5 people living with us, 5 different families living with us. I think the combined income was like $30,000 a year when I grew up. To not be able to help the family. I had lost a relationship where I was engaged. I ultimately lost my job. I lost my relationship with my family. And I honestly believe I was losing my mind. When you do that much drugs, it obviously creates a psychosis. And I believed that I had bugs crawling on one of those was that I had bugs crawling on me. And I would spend hours and hours picking at what were imaginary bugs crawling on me. I took all my clothes in my entire house to a same-day cleaner once to say, can I have bugs on my clothes? And the guy was like, you're crazy. I'm like, just do it, clean them. And then I started putting my clothes and my furniture out on the balcony to hopefully freeze the bugs in the winter. And then one day, I get to be reminded of this when I shave every morning, that I have a scar here that started out as a simple pimple, but one day under the influence of drugs, I believed it was a bug and I drilled through my face with a corkscrew to go after it. But that's what we do. And up until that last stage, I was employed. I was showing up. I was living in this kind of an environment where people on Astor Street don't know who is living next to them. My employer, I subsequently learned, had 50 meetings about me, but never a meeting with me. Until the last meeting was that you were fired. And they didn't fire me because of drugs, and they didn't say that. I get why I got fired. But what was interesting was the denial, because they knew me not to be somebody who drank, not even did drugs. Same with my family and friends. Nobody knew what to do. And the result was, because nobody knew what to do or how to do it or were afraid or were in their own denial, I was left to get sicker. At the end, I never attempted suicide, but I started the process. I couldn't believe where I'd ended up. How I had nothing going for me. How I had everything going for me. And now I'm worse than I ever was. Now I'm also addicted. So, suicide was an out that I considered. Obviously the reason I'm here today is because I chose treatment and got help. And I'm happy to say that it was 23 years ago that I went to treatment, and I haven't taken a drug or a drink since that day. And in a few months, I'll celebrate my 24th year of continuous sobriety. Thank you. This is a very important graphic that I think this will be available in the packages later, or I could get it to you. That's been researched for a long time. This is the Jellinek curve. And Jellinek was one of the leading medical researchers that worked at Yale in the 60s, that was part of the ASAM group that, in the 50s, sorry, it was part of the ASAM group that defined addiction as a disease, who defined a path of the addiction process and the recovery process. And that part down the bottom of that spinning is when you're in that chronic, can't quit, can't control usage stage. But it's pretty predictable. It was something we use in treatment to kind of help patients understand where they're at and also to share the hope of where they can be. This became an important tool for me. It's an important tool that I share with families when I'm working with them or individuals to show them where the path is going to be if they don't stop usage and the hope of where they'll be when they stop using. Treatment got me sober. I will tell you that the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous helped me become the man that I am today. I am much better in every way because I'm in recovery than I ever was even in the days before I started using. When I stopped using, was in treatment, I thought my career would pretty much be over. I had been working, this is how sometimes our higher powers have a real joke. I was in a halfway house and after treatment. And they said, you have to get a job. You bring back some structure in your life. But we don't want you to do anything too stressful. And then one of the technicians in the house, in the halfway house said, hey, there's a job for a computer guy. I'm like, hey, I'll take that one. I'm all about computers. And I went to this place and I found that they only hire people who are in halfway houses and help you transition back. And they paid you $5 an hour. And my job was to take precious metal out of the computers. And then the first box of computers I had to open up were Zenith computers. And the logo on it was one that I had sold to Hewlett-Packard, which I actually did the deal. So it had gone full circle. I kind of laughed about it at the time. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this, and went with it. But I kind of thought my career was over, but little by little I started trying to get back into work. And then one day I got a call from a headhunter who said, we got a great startup company in Illinois who knows about you and wants you to come work for them. And I was thrilled because I thought my career was going to be over. And I said, but you got to know something about you. I said, with a little bit of detail, I am now a drug addict in recovery. And I actually talking to the CEO now. He goes, Bob, it's because of your story that we're calling you. He said, my father was in recovery. And he always said, if you could get a guy who's working a good program in recovery, who knows business to work for you, grab them, because they're usually better. And I think I have become better. As I'm on that right side of that continuum of care about getting better, that top of that is that interest in a new way of life, and life is better than ever was before, I think is the end of my story. Today, I think that's where I'm at. That's the same house, by the way, in the same corner as that corner. Looks a little bit different. The dog's a lot happier now. And I've also been able to get out of my own way long enough that I'm happily married and have 2 children. And I get to work for a great organization like Hazeldon. I've paid millions of dollars in taxes over this journey. I've been able to publish a book. I've been able to help a lot of families, and now I get a chance to represent the Hazeldon Foundation in my story. I don't think the drug is important. I think what's important is the path. I never wanted to be a drug addict, but drugs took me down the path. That, like so many of us, we don't start out saying we want to ruin our lives. That just happens. There is that genetic predisposition that Jody talked about. My father, my grandmother were all alcoholics. My dad was never much of a father, but I came to good grips with that now too, because I wouldn't have been very much of a father either in my using days, because that's how this goes. That's how it works. What I want to debunk today is a couple myths about addiction. I don't know how many of you have heard addiction talked about as a lack of willpower. Let me just be real blunt. It's a disease. Have any of you ever had a stomach problem? Have you ever had diarrhea? What degree of willpower is going to help you? I mean, it's not a real good strategy. That's all I can tell you. The same with addiction. It's not about willpower. We made bad choices, so there might be that component of it, but we didn't choose to ruin our lives. The other myth is that you've got to be ready for treatment. The treatment will work otherwise. That's not true. One of the businesses I had created was a business that helped families recover from addiction. And it also helped get people into a treatment that weren't necessarily willing. Every day we would wake up somebody somewhere or go to a workplace somewhere where they had no intention that day of getting help. And a high percentage of those went to treatment, and a higher percentage of those even stayed sober. So that's not true. That your willingness to go to treatment isn't as important as your willingness once you leave treatment. Getting to treatment is the key. The other stigma, and I think that this is probably the worst and the most cruel, and why meetings like this is important. I don't know how many of you have heard that an alcoholic has to hit bottom first. I thank you for raising your hands. That's the myth. That's horrible. And that's cruel. Why would we say that somebody has to get worse before they could get better? No other disease would we have that belief that you've got cancer, call me in 6 months when you're worse. Or with insurance before parity. We're not going to give you treatment for that because it's a moral issue. Or I work with some insurance companies who said, we're not going to approve anybody for treatment who's a son of a Chicago policeman, because Chicago policemen's sons never recover from opiate addiction. Like, how do you get to make that decision? And where does those prejudices play into? I think a lot of it, too, is that it's that stigma about we're in denial as addicts, which is an interesting component about the disease. Sometimes we deny that we're sick, and then once we realize we're sick, we don't want help or we refuse help. But that also goes for the family and the family system. My family was absolutely dysfunctional when it came to my illness. My workplace was, confused. I got to have some impact. I had 300 employees, $300 million in personal revenue on the executive leadership board. I had to have an effect on the business, but nobody knew what to do. And I think it's about that conversation. How do you talk to somebody who you think is sick? And I could say honesty. Honesty is always the right practice. I had a call from a consulting company yesterday who said they work with some of the largest wealth management. They're a wealth management company, and they work with some of the largest families who have their own office managing wealth. And they said, we're seeing more and more opiate addiction in our family office. Working some of the biggest names that you can imagine, like these big family names. And I said, well, how do you deal with it? And they said, well, we don't know. But we're not sure we should bring it up. We're not sure we should address it. And I said, well, if somebody had cancer or big growth on the side of their neck and they came to a wealth meeting and they had a big growth on the side of their neck, would you say something? They say, absolutely. We would ask them, what's going on? Have you gotten help? And if they didn't know what was going on or they didn't have help, we would help them find the best place to find treatment. And I'm like, well, why is addiction differently? Again, since 1956, it's been defined as an illness. A chronic illness, later defined as a brain disease. Why are we afraid to approach somebody? I think that Jody's point earlier on about legal rights, understanding those are really important. And thank God the laws are changing now where they could no longer discriminate from those with alcoholism and those with mental health issues that they have reasons. So again, meetings like this allow us to debunk some of the myths, to have honest conversations about what's going on, and recognizing that 1 out of every 3 of you probably got something going on somewhere in your family or workplace, or will have something going on. So the reality of where addiction is a chronic illness on the scale of other chronic illnesses, but with a much higher cost and risk. We've given it a lot less attention than we have other drugs and other illnesses. But because of the publicity around opiates and the rising costs, we have a new opportunity to look at things. This puts it in perspective about chronic illnesses and what we've done organizationally to address chronic illnesses. Addiction is on par with diabetes and heart disease. The cost is between, I use $100 billion, but I've heard between $100 and $500 billion in workplaces. You can see there that we're basically twice as costly or unpredictable or at more risk in violence. We're doing a lot of work at the Hazeldon Betty Ford Foundation today with healthcare systems and hospital systems to help educate physicians and emergency workers and care workers, to help reduce the cost of healthcare costs for medical surgical. It's pretty amazing that 38% of the beds that are being used in a hospital today are used as a result of the direct results of the consequences of addiction or medical issues, result of addiction. And the number of emergency visits that we have as a result of addiction. To understand how this might affect you and your businesses directly, there's a link here to the alcoholic cost calculator, which has been widely used in some of the government studies to help predict what cost will be to you. And you could go in there and type in how many employees you have, in what manufacturing sector or what business sector you're in, what location you're in, and it will help you understand addiction in some real detail. And I just pulled up a couple different numbers here of an example of 1,000 employees in a manufacturing environment in Chicago, in Wisconsin, in Illinois, that would show you some ideas of cost. But clearly the costs are staggering. I think the opportunity to address addiction is a lot about what Jody talked about. Update your work policies. And I'll just add a couple things to that. I think you need a strategy within your management group that talks about how will you address it. So what happens when somebody does test positive? What happens when somebody shows up who smells like alcohol? What do you do when you're the school bus driver's coworker and you know something's going on? What do you do? How do you have the conversation? Who has the conversation? And the one exception I'll take to Jody's slides was EAP. I don't see EAP being a good solution here because people today are so unsure of who they could trust in the workplace that unless you change the culture. Our research shows that so many people are afraid to even find out what their benefits are for addiction because of stigma and culture that they're not willing to get help. So EAP alone won't be enough. And if you say, I looked at my EAP numbers and it doesn't indicate that I've got a healthcare problem, bad data. Just because you're not utilizing your EAP doesn't mean that you don't have a problem. Jody talked about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I will say that you really need to be extra diligent in safety-sensitive positions of high risks. And I don't know how many of you are business owners that might be in a partnership arrangement with your organization, but I would not have a partnership agreement that didn't have a behavioral health or substance abuse clause in there, so that I've got some form of ability to take action if my business partner is impaired from alcohol, opiates, or other drugs. And I would make sure that my policies, my insurance policies, cover treatment, and that those policies covered the cost of the medications that will improve treatment outcomes. And I would also make sure that I have good providers in our network that are using evidence-based practices. Jody again talked about medication-assisted therapy. The data and the evidence is out there that shows that medication can improve the recovery rates and save lives for opiates. But the treatment industry is very fragmented. There's a lot of what I call mom-and-pop treatment centers who grew out of 12-step programs and their own philosophies that have done really good work, but they don't philosophically necessarily agree with the use of medication for the treatment of opiate dependency. And I'm a member of the 12 steps of alcohol. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. I get it inside the rooms of AA, and you get to pick who you're in a meeting with. I get that. But from a science perspective, as a treatment perspective, I don't get it. Hazeldon Betty Ford was the original founder of the abstinence-based model in the country, where we're not using drugs and alcohol in treatment. We're not using drugs in treatment. 4.5 years ago, before this really popped up as a big, opiates popped up as a big epidemic, we simply saw it showing up at our doors with more and more people with opiate dependency who were leaving our doors early and dying. So how it showed up for us is we lost more deaths to the point that was no longer something that we couldn't address. And we had to make the strong changes culturally and politically that moved us into medication treatment. We lost board members, we lost donors, we lost employees, we lost alumni in the process. We had partners, treatment providers who wouldn't work with us. But we made the decision. Today, I think any legitimate treatment provider better be using medication-assisted therapy to help treat their addicts because it gives them the chance. It gives them a chance to go to treatment, to stay in treatment while they're detoxing, to get some time so that curve, that gel curve, gets a chance to work with them. We're just completing a four-year study on this, and our opiate addicts are actually doing better now than some of our other populations that we serve. And those are with, those who've stayed on medication and some of those who've come off of medication, because we gave them that chance to transition into recovery. And I just want to kind of close with a couple slides on healthcare costs. If we could invest, in the culture, being comfortable to talk about it, treat addiction like any other disease. We start to measure it, not just by EAP statistics, but look at the total healthcare cost. I think you'll get some interesting returns. This is a study that we did with the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, where we looked at 4,000 patients, which I'm told is statistically appropriate, the year before treatment and the year after treatment. And on average, there was the addict the year before treatment spent 11 days in the hospital, and a little over 1 day in the hospital the year after treatment. Productivity, the biggest gain there was in absenteeism, where you could see that there was 9 days of unplanned absences before treatment, and a little more than 2 the year after treatment, and those outcomes continue to improve. So, the cost of treatment and treatment outcomes are very similar to other chronic illnesses. As you can see, the myth that treatment doesn't work is kind of debunked by the outcomes of treating addiction, comparing them to the other diseases. And treatment works. Those are obvious, and the obvious bottom line, which is always about bottom lines in business, but the ultimate bottom line is that it saves lives. So my hope for you all in closing today is that through the speakers and through these sessions, that maybe you go back to your work environments or to your homes and you start to change the culture. And you start to take action, and you have the willingness to influence change. My last bullet point there is intervention works. The sooner you can get to somebody who's struggling, the more resources you can provide them, the sooner they get the treatment, the sooner they get in recovery, the easier it is to cost, the cheaper it is to cost, and it will have less impact on you, your customers, your employees, and your family. And in closing, the same situation will apply at home. If you think something's going on at home with somebody, say something. Turn dinner into a point where you have important conversations, not about news, weather, and sports. Have the conversation about what's going on and how can I help. In closing, I'll just say that this showed up at my house with my young son. We sat down at dinner and it was high as a kite. And I'm like, okay, this is my chance. I pulled out my book and said, we're going to do it by the book. I said, it's not okay for you to use drugs in my house. His mom denied it. His other family members denied it. And we had an honest discussion. I said, Jack, you could use drugs if you want. I'll make you be the best drug addict you could be in the world. I'll wish you all the luck in the world. But you can't use drugs and live in my house. There's nothing I won't do to help you, but there's nothing I'm going to do to support you, to enable you. I said, you could get help or you could leave. Which would you prefer? And his mom started crying and said, I can't kick him out, and I get that. And his brother started crying, and the one who didn't cry was Jack, and turned to me and he said, I need help. And he too got help on that day, and he's been sober and clean ever since. But if we wouldn't have had the courage and we didn't have the experience and we didn't have the hope, who knows what he would have done. And that's my hope for you, is that you don't overcomplicate this. Treat this like any other family or workplace emergency. Treat this like any other disease. And do what you've already been doing. Just do it with addiction. And hopefully the magic of recovery and the hope of recovery for all of those that you'll impact will come true like they did for me. I couldn't imagine where my life would be today if I wasn't in recovery. I never wanted to be an alcoholic and an addict, but I thank God today that I'm in recovery, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share today too. Thank you. Thank you.